Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast for a special episode produced in association with Gallagher Specialty. You're listening to an independent podcast focused on geopolitical risk, to serve risk professionals and decision makers in specialty insurance markets, reinsurance and beyond. Our topic is earth-moving political risks, mining industry expropriation risk in Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm your host David Benyon, and to talk about this, I'm very pleased to say that my guest for this special episode is Rupert Morgan, Executive Director of Credit and Political Risks at Arthur J. Gallagher International. Without further ado, let's get into it. Welcome, Rupert.
Thank you, Dave. Good to be here.
So your team at Gallagher Specialty provides political risk solutions and access to global specialist insurance markets. You want to just give me a bit of an introduction to your role personally?
I've been specialising in political risk insurance for some 35 years now, the last 15 of which have been within Gallagher Specialty here in London. My role within the structured credit and political risk team is to head up the political risk unit.
So how do Gallagher Specialty's political risk insurance capabilities relate specifically to Australia, that part of the world, and to the mining sector?
Well, whilst we cover all sectors in all geographies, one of our key areas of focus has always been mining. Both in my career at Gallagher and before, I've specialised in mining, and it's particularly fortuitous that within Gallagher we have a very strong resource in Australia in political risks, and indeed that resource is headquartered and led out of Perth, which of course is the centre of the Australian mining industry.
Very soon, in fact, probably imminent to when this episode goes out. You're probably in the air or you're already there. You're going to be headed to Perth for the Africa Down Under conference on 4th and 6th September. So first of all, this seems like a very timely conversation.
Yes, indeed. It's a very important conference. We've had a presence there every year for the last 15 years. I'm a regular attendee, as are my local colleagues in Perth. We see it as a very important opportunity for us to demonstrate our commitment to the mining sector. We're one of the few brokers that does regularly attend the conference.
There's a political risk and mining project insurance solutions for mining investors document that you provide, which provides some comparison of political risk insurance premium rates for at least a dozen African countries. That document's going to be really important for our conversation today. Do you want to just give us a bit of an introduction to it?
Yes, of course. So as you rightly say, when we attend this and other similar conferences, we provide a flyer, which is a brief document, which amongst other things covers off indicative political risk premium rates for the countries in which we most regularly see mining related opportunities. These range from perhaps the most benign environments and up to those where you would think that no right-minded person would contemplate investing in the mining sector, let alone ensuring the attendant political risk. In that document, we also provide a brief summary of political risk insurance cover so that the clients and prospects alike have a rough guide to what it is that the political risk insurance can do for them.
When we talk about these countries, it's not just about the territory, it's very much about the individual client, the who that you're placing cover for. So is it possible to kind of give an overall summary view, a flavour of how you see the market at the moment?
Absolutely. As you say, when political risk insurers assess and analyse and underwrite the political risk on a mining investment in Sub-Saharan Africa, they obviously are concerned with the nature of the project, the location of the project, but almost more than anything, it's about the who. Who is it that they're looking to insure? Political risk underwriters very much see themselves in partnership with the policyholder and see the policyholders representing their interests in country.
There's an average year-on-year rate change in there of 7%, but I'm not sure how much that tells us really, because when you dig into each of the territories, as we will, at least 5 of them, there's quite a broad variety of different performers.
Yes, in fact, the year-on-year comparison is a feature we brought in for the first time a couple of years ago, when in making that comparison, it was apparent that across a similar bunch of countries, the mean rate increase year-on-year was something in the region of 30%. So we put that in there just to illustrate as if the mining community needed any further illustration of the perils of investing in some of these territories in Sub-Saharan Africa. This year's statistic shows, as you say, a much more modest 7% rate increase. It's not a particularly meaningful statistic because obviously each of these countries needs to be underwritten on its own merits. And I would suggest that whilst indicative, these rates are by no means set in concrete, and each insurer will have their own interpretation of their own assessment of the risk and a view of each client.
We've chosen to focus on 5 sub-Saharan African countries. And these are going to be Burkina Faso, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, Ghana, Mali, and Tanzania. It's fair to say that each one is very relevant for the market, but perhaps each for quite different reasons. So, Rupert, how would you characterise the selection?
Okay, by taking the 5 countries that you mentioned, lifting them out of the list of 12 on our brochure, we have a selection which represent those countries where we most regularly see opportunities and have done over many years, those countries where perhaps the perception is of being a relatively benign environment, as well as those where the opposite applies, particularly in the case of Mali, we'll come on to in a minute, and also perhaps the country where the risk perception has improved the most over the last year or two. Let's start with Burkina. The reason Burkina is on the list more than anything else is it's where over the last 5-10 years we've seen by some measure the greatest number of opportunities in the mining sector. It has a well-established mining code. Obviously, there have been issues in the country, depending on what matrix you judge by. There's either been 1 or 1.5 or perhaps even 2 coups in the last 2 years. Obviously, issues like that do massively impact underwriters' appetite for Burkinabe risk.
It's a rate riser, year-on-year increase of 9% in the September 24 brochure. Is that a reflection of that coup activity?
At least in part, yes. Also, there was talk of a review of the mining code, which obviously is something that does impact insurers' appetite. The government were perhaps contemplating increasing the share of royalties they demand from each foreign investor operating in the mining sector in that country.
It's obviously not the easiest country from a political risk perspective, but why focus on it? I mean, it's a landlocked, on the surface, quite poor West African country, former French colony, doesn't have the most stable of neighbours, particularly Niger and also Mali. Why focus on it? Are there many opportunities?
I think the simple answer is it's the abundant natural resources, in particular gold. And it's that gold is the mineral where we see most mining-related activity. So I think it's as simple as that.
Is it a few big risks or many bits of business?
In our experience, it's a few large risks, but there are plenty of other mining projects there. Obviously, we're not involved in every single one, even though we do have significant interest in those projects.
Well, let's talk about Mali. This is not an easy territory to operate in. It's increasingly seen as a Russian ally. There was a military coup in 2021. The former colonial power, France, has exited. Mali's been suspended from ECOWAS, but it's been viewed historically as a source of a major gold mining country, right? I mean, this has been a big source of business, this country.
Yes, we don't see many Malian opportunities these days. It's on the list partly for the shock value. We don't actually identify a rate range for Mali. We describe it as case specific, which is another way of saying that we do believe that for the right project, in the right part of the country, for the right investor, there would be appetite within the political risk insurance market. But we're not brave enough to put a rate on it, or foolhardy enough to put a rate on it. As you say, there are concerns about the Russian influence. They're very quick to fill the vacuum left by the departing historical colonial power France and UN peacekeeping forces last year. So it's obviously a very ripe environment for Russia to extend their influence throughout the region, particularly the Sahel.
This is a high-risk, borderline basket case of a country in general, but for the right client, for the right specifics involved, it's still possible. It's not just off-risk, is it?
It's not off-risk, no. You know, as a broker, we always consider the glass to be half full, never say die. We're very reluctant to describe countries as being off risk. Mali is there or thereabouts, but as I say, for the right deal, the right project, for the right applicant, we believe there is still modest appetite for political risk insurance.
Well, let's move southward onto perhaps a territory that's a little bit easier to do business historically, Ghana.
Yeah, Ghana, historical source of mining-related opportunities for us and for the market as a whole. Lots of activity there over many, many years. Increasing concerns around the Chinese influence, particularly with the heavy indebtedness of the Ghanaian government to the Chinese. Perhaps even at a stretch, there may be potentially a risk of a Western-owned asset maybe being transferred to Chinese ownership as a way of repaying some of that Chinese debt. Clearly, such a step by the Ghanaian government would be covered by a political risk insurance policy. So a risk of which certainly we're aware. It may seem a little extreme, but we're talking extremes in this part of the world.
So it's sovereign non-payment or expropriation?
In that case, expropriation of the asset by the Ghanaian government where they have no right to do so and where they're assuming there's inadequate compensation, because obviously expropriation with adequate compensation would not be expropriatory in its nature. Obviously, the degree of compensation or the adequacy of the compensation is in the eye of the beholder.
The influence of Chinese investment, obviously that will be one hypothetical you just talked about, but I'm just interested in how it's had a noticeable effect so far. Does it mean that there's less mining sector political risk premium being placed within Western markets?
The Chinese would generally not buy commercial political risk insurance. They have their own insurance company, Sinosure. Anecdotally, I did hear of a Chinese risk that did come to the market because Sinosure wouldn't touch it. Now, make of that what you will, but I think it's extremely unlikely that with their disregard of all things ESG and corporate social responsibility, the likelihood of a Chinese mining company being insured in the commercial political risk market is remote.
I'm just conscious that Ghana has this reputation for stability historically. It does feel like a territory that there's a bit more trust than some of these other markets.
Well, there's the paradox. Of the 5 countries that we're focusing on today, Ghana, just based on the rate range alone, would appear to be one of the more manageable risks. But as I say, the Chinese component is of concern.
But it's a year-on-year increase of 9% as well, so it's one of the risers in there.
As I say, we shouldn't read too much into the rate fluctuations because of the number of different factors involved in analysing and underwriting and assessing the political risk.
So the DRC, it's in the news for a variety of different reasons, usually whether it's militias, M23 rebels, its role in the global economy for precious metals and minerals that are used for batteries for EVs, that kind of thing. And there's been price rises 2 years in a row as well in this market. Has the risk perception changed?
The risk perception has changed. The risk perception has deteriorated, no question about it. It's a very, very large country, but nonetheless, insurers are concerned about the ongoing civil unrest in the east of the country and north and south Kivu provinces. Mining is focused mostly in the southeast of the country in Katanga province, which has been a source of mining projects to the market for as long as we can remember. We first placed political risk insurance on a mining project in DRC probably 25 years ago.
So I don't know much about the unrest in Kivu. So is it the type of SRCC type civil unrest that can spill over and
Yeah, I mean, there is a risk of further contagion. One of the downsides of it was the recent closure of the Zambian border, the DRC-Zambian border, which obviously would be problematic for the mining sector because of that is an export route out of DRC. I think the border is now reopened. This is only a few days ago. So there are issues around that.
That's very much a political risk issue. I mean, if you can't get materials out or access to resources.
Absolutely. The issues of that nature can and will be included within what you would expect a political risk insurance policy to cover. So, as I say, historically a source of mining opportunities amongst the better known mining codes and sources of key minerals in the region.
Are the mining assets, political risk business, quite concentrated? What are they? Where are they? You already mentioned Kivu and Katanga.
Yeah, happily, the mining-related assets in the country are not located in the Kivu provinces, but rather further south in the southeast of the country in Katanga province, which is very rich in minerals and has long-standing source of related opportunities for the market.
And it's worth noting that on the sample of indicative rates, the DRC has a 10% year-on-year increase between last year and this year.
When I alluded to the fact that I think it was the first political risk policy on a mining project that I placed was in DRC 25 years ago. And probably worth saying that however elevated those rates are, 25 years ago, I went to the market and I was sent packing with a 5% rate and came back with a binding order at 4.5% a month later. But that was a function of the market's limited experience of insuring mining projects in Africa, in DRC or anywhere else in Africa. So even though that's an elevated rate by comparison with just about anywhere else on that sheet, nonetheless, when underwriters first started underwriting mining projects in Africa, the rates were necessarily higher because they didn't have the experience to fall back on. The underwriting community is now much more familiar with and aware of mining codes and the local regulatory environment around mining, etc.
Tanzania is going through something of a mining resurgence at the moment. It's a country that's rich in metals like gold and nickel and copper and cobalt, but it's also been lately linked with alternative dispute resolutions, ADR. So we'll get into that. It's been a bit up and down on your pricing index between 2023 and 2024. Well, why is that?
Well, it's all relative. If we were to compare the pricing that we've indicated in this year's conference brochure for Tanzania with the other four countries in which we're focusing, it is by some margin the cheapest, for want of a better word. That is a function of, as much as anything, the improved investment environment thanks to the relatively new President Suluhu, who succeeded President Magufuli on his death in March 2021 when he was in office. She's overseen an environment which is more attractive to foreign investment. I suggest that goes beyond just mining into other sectors. Yes, we have seen a year-on-year increase in our indicative rates, but that is as much as anything, I think, a function of concerns around ongoing, as you alluded to, arbitration and investment disputes between the government and Western investors across many sectors. If you were to look at the ICSID website, then that would reveal more detail around that. So these are very much in the public domain, these issues, but yes, mostly Magufuli legacy issues rather than attributable to the new president, who has really been a bit like a breath of fresh air. And in fact, in an interview I gave to Paydirt, which is the company that organizes the Africa Down Under conference, I did actually describe them last year as Tanzania as the poster boy for mining in Sub-Saharan Africa, perhaps tempting providence by doing so. But nonetheless, we still find it a country in which there is strong interest at what I would call reasonable rates for political risk insurance.
Yeah. Loitering in the background, we have these disputes, the ADR going on. But despite that, is it fair to say that Tanzania has been seen as a much improved territory from a political risk perspective?
No question about it. Whilst we're showing a modest increase in the rate year on year, that is attributable principally to concerns around ongoing investment disputes between Western investors and the government, the bulk of which are legacy issues from the administration of the former President Magufuli, who died in office in March 2021, and who was then succeeded by President Suluhu, who has done a much better job at attracting foreign investment and making the country a more attractive investment for foreign investment. By way of contrast, if you go back 7 or 8 years, the administration of Magufuli imposed an entirely arbitrary tax demand of some $950 million on an Australian mining company. So despite underwriters' concerns around the ongoing arbitration issues, I think this demonstrates that it's a much brighter picture today than it was under Magufuli's regime.
Okay, so aside from your imminent trip down under to Perth for the ADU conference, there's also a pretty big publication due out around about the time this podcast comes out, certainly in September, which is Gallagher Specialty's Structured Credit and Political Risk Insurance Market Update, Q3 iteration.
This is a report we've been putting together now before I joined Gallagher in 2010. It started off with 2 or 3 sheets of A4 stapled together, but now it's become a rather more significant and important document, which we believe is very well received by the market. The purpose of it is basically to summarize latest news, highlight any changes in markets' capabilities, and provide some high-level thoughts on a few of the topics at the forefront of both our clients' and underwriters' minds when considering opportunities for the forthcoming year.
And that's globally, and it's obviously not just mining sector. It's
not just mining,
sectors.
No, that covers off all the different product lines within the wider structured credit and political risk insurance product offering. We also talk to the tenor that each market is able to underwrite and the size of capacity that they can commit to each of those different product lines. So we list out all the markets in the commercial political risk market, all insurers in the political risk market globally, some 60 odd, that's comprising both Lloyd's syndicates and companies. We also include a brief summary of the product lines and also a little bit of information about any movements within the different underwriting markets.
Well, Rupert, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for a very insightful walkthrough of some key political risk markets.
Thank you, Dave. I enjoyed that and hope the audience found it to be of some interest.
Thank you for listening to this special episode in association with Gallagher Specialty. I've been your host, David Benyon, and I'd like to thank my guest, Rupert Morgan. That's all for now, but we'll be back with another episode soon. Please tune in next time. Production was by Peter McGill and Lawrence Durkin made the music.